Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Hope you all slept well. I know it was tougher getting up today than the last 2 days. I don't know why, but it was 2 days of golf wearing me out. But we'll spend this session this morning talking a little bit about scleral shape. So why it's relevant, I guess, how we measure it, and where it's taking us for the future. I would dare say that, 20 years ago, we probably all didn't care about what the sclera was shaped like. It's kind of irrelevant. But as we fit larger contact lenses, it becomes relevant, because if we're trying to get an ideal fit, then it's helpful to understand what the shape of the eye is like beyond the cornea. Just disclosures. So again, why do we care about this? It's mainly because of the use of scleral contact lenses and other large lenses. Soft lenses could be included in this as well. And the utilization of these is growing, so we want to talk about a growing part of our practices. If in case there's any doubt as to the interest, Bausch & Lomb is having an event in about a month where we had 170 doctors sign up for a workshop, and the workshop filled up within 8 hours of being announced. So there's definitely interest in this area. And again, getting an optimal fit requires aligning the lens to the shape of the eye. And when we don't align, we find problems with lens fit. When we fit too flat, we end up with edge lift that creates awareness and discomfort. When we end up with edge lift or a loose fit, we get dye and we get debris flowing in that causes fogging. And when we get too tight of a fit, we can end up with problems like redness, discomfort, and conjunctival hypertrophy. So there are several instruments available now that will actually allow us to image the shape of the sclera and cornea simultaneously. We'll talk about these three instruments briefly and how they work, and then what kind of maps we get from that. We're all used to looking at corneal topography, and most of the time we look at corneal topography, we're looking at curvature maps, etc. When we look at scleral topography, we need to get used to looking at it always in terms of elevation, because that's really the way that we present the information. So these are elevation-based topographies, where the red are the high points and the blue are the low points, and therefore the blue area is actually the steepest part of the shape of the eye. It's a little bit like looking at a topographical map of like the Earth, where we see the high points are shown in hotter colors and the low points are shown in blue colors. This is how scleral topography is going to be presented to us as well. So again, if we go back to these maps, if you look at a map here, the red being high points and the blue being low points, we have to realize then that the blue has a steeper rate of curvature as it plummets down to the low points where it's blue. So again, just a brief overview of these three instruments that are used in practice here. The first one I'll talk about is the SMAP 3D. It looks like this little guy here. It looks like Wall-E, I suppose. What we end up with here is to take the map, the SMAP utilizes fluorescein in the eye, and you can see with the grid that it projects. Now, you don't see the grid all the time, but when you align the map and you go to take the image and you press the button, this blue grid flashes on the eye for just a split second, and the image is obtained. Again, they recommend use of fluorox or an anesthetic type of fluorescein. I don't use that in my practice. I just use a fluorescein strip with a lubricant. And with the SMAP, you have three images you take. You take a straight gaze, an up gaze, and a down gaze. And the three images have to look good. Here's an image of someone taking an up gaze. We align the crosshair to the lower limbus in up gaze, the central pupil in straight gaze, and the superior limbus in down gaze. And then when we get our images like this, and the red area designates the data capture that will process and be used, and the green area designates the limbus, and that's important for the SMAP because it stitches the three images together and it uses the limbus as its reference point. And so what we end up with is this 3D look of the anterior eye, taken from three separate maps and combined into one. And then we get these elevation maps generated from the instrument. This is one thing to keep in mind here as we look at the central part is all red in all of these maps. And that's because these are scleral elevation maps, not corneal elevation maps. Because the cornea and the sclera have such different shapes, we have to use a different reference sphere to describe the cornea and the sclera when we use the SMAP. So this area here, if you want the data inside the black ring, you have to look at a different corneal elevation map. But in this map, we're looking just at scleral elevation alone. So this central part is essentially not showing up on our printout. And what we can see again, if we realize the way that these maps work, is these areas in dark blue are the deepest or farthest away from us. So this is actually the steepest part of the scleral shape. And these lighter blue colors are higher points or flatter curvature areas. And so we can see here an astigmatic pattern, essentially where the steep meridian is at about 60, so a somewhat oblique to with the rule type of eye shape. Here we see one that's more of an against the rule shape, where the steep meridian is here at about 160, and the flat meridian up around 70. And here's one that's relatively spherical shape all the way around. Again, the SMAP does have software built in for lens design, but it really only works with the Europa Scleral lens because the company that makes it also has a working relationship with the Visionary Optics Lab. So the instrument does generate scleral lenses, but only the design that comes with the instrument. The eye surface profiler is another instrument that does scleral imaging, profilometry. It again looks a bit like Wall-E. And the concept for taking the map is essentially the same, in that we need to instill fluorescein, and we like to add a lubricant drop to the surface of the eye first to help stabilize the tear layer and hold it onto the eye longer. So we'll often with these images or with these instruments, we'll put a drop of lubricant in the eye first, give the patient half a minute or so to blink and distribute it, and then we'll add the fluorescein strip wetted with a little bit more lubricant. And again, I like to add a touch of saline first, just to kind of get the fluorescein off the strip, if you will, and liquefied, and then add a drop of lubricant to the strip after that to pull the dye into the lubricant. Do you have a question? So, one thing that's I think is helpful to note with all of these images is when we're trying to take a fluorescein capture of the eye is when we retract the lids to pull the eyes open to get a good map, is we don't want to drag the lid wiper across the ocular surface more than necessary, as I feel like it does tend to wipe the dye off the eye a little bit. So we're careful with retracting the lids and trying not to pull fluorescein off the eye when we do that. Again, what we see when we look inside is we see a grid with dots to line up, and we simply line up the crosshairs with the focus dots, and then once everything is in alignment, we press the button, and we get a cobalt blue grid that is projected onto the eye for just a split second. The image is captured. And with the eye surface profiler, the difference between this and the SMAP is really that it does everything with a single image. It has multiple cameras inside, and just one image capture is all you need. You don't need an up gaze and a down gaze as well. It doesn't do any stitching per se, but it does do merging or combining of images. If you take multiple maps, you can merge them into a single map that helps sometimes to get a better data coverage. Again, because the eye surface profiler is not affiliated with any lab in particular, they have multiple designs. So there's up to 30 or more scleral and corneal lens designs that are built into the software that you can design a lens with. And again, this is how the map looks. There's lots of data here if you're curious. It tells you all sorts of things about the shape of the eye, the corneal diameter, eccentricity. So you can use this for more than just scleral lens fitting. And so with the eye surface profile, there's actually a fair number of corneal lens designs that are built in as well. Again, this is just a couple images of the data capture you get. You see centrally a corneal map, and then here peripherally you see a scleral map. And again, there's this sharp red area in between the zones, and that's because our reference sphere changes in that zone. The final instrument we'll mention is the pentacam. And the pentacam has, among other things, has the capability of doing scleral imaging as well. Here you can see a scleral shape map as part of the pentacam software. How this works, if you've ever used a pentacam, it's simply you're looking straight at a target, you line everything up, and then it has a slit beam that scans, rotating 360 degrees, capturing shine fluke images every so many degrees. With the corneoscleral profiling software, you actually have to have capture 5 scans. So we do a straight gaze, and up, down, left, and right. And then the instrument, again, takes those 5 images and merges them into a single image. It's a little tricky sometimes to get good maps. And so you'll take a single map, and it processes, and you have to ensure that it's a good map before you can move on to the next scan. One nice thing about the pentacam is it doesn't require fluorescein, so that's helpful. At the same time, it is 5 scans, and I probably find it the hardest one to get good scleral imaging with, so it can be time consuming to get 5 good scans of the eye. It works essentially the same. One thing of note is it can be difficult to capture superior data, as you can imagine, because of the upper lid. And so we have spacers that we apply to the lens bar, the forehead rest, to space the head back to capture those images. Again, this is the data we get. These are individual scans. Like I said, it takes slit scans 360 degrees around. And these are actually the captured shape images of the eye. And the color here is basically to tell you which of the scans captured that piece of this puzzle. The gray area is your central scan, and the green parts of these lines right here was from your superior scan. The red parts from the inferior scan, nasal and temporal. So it's basically telling you which of your 5 scans captured that bit of data. And then from that, again, you see your coverage map, how much data you have. You have your scleral and corneal topography printed out here. And then just a bunch of other data, the sagittal height at the flat, steep meridian. Again, similar to the eye surface profiler, gives you quite a bit of data to consider the shape of this eye. And again, each of these components has value in verifying the quality. And then when it comes to like scleral lens fitting, using this data up here can be helpful in creating a lens very accurately. So again, just to kind of recap what we see with scleral topography when we capture an image, we're going to have 2 separate reference spheres. We're going to have a corneal reference sphere, and we're going to have a scleral reference sphere. And again, if we had a single reference sphere for the entire eye, it would be very difficult to interpret the shape of the eye accurately. So we often have this ring which designates, and again, keep in mind that the shape of the eye doesn't really look like that in that zone. That's a transition zone between our reference spheres is all that's showing you. But you do have corneal data, you do have scleral data, and again, some of the instruments will do overlay your corneal map and your scleral map with the reference spheres being separate. Others will show you one at a time individually. And just again as a reference, colors are kind of opposite of what we would normally think of when we talk about corneal topography maps. Again, what we can see, you can see what I would call an essentially against the rule sclera right here. If we were looking at a corneal map and we were flat going north and south, we would attribute that to an against the rule cornea, and so I just refer to it as an against the rule sclera. These folks, if we put a scleral lens on their eye, we're going to see tight fit going this direction and flat fit in this meridian. And this would be an eye that you would immediately look at and say, I need a toric haptic on my lens. We can also see spherical shapes, as well as we consider a more with the rule, slightly oblique looking scleral shape where we are steep in the north and south meridian. We can also see other interesting findings, such as this eye, which has an asymmetric shape. This is actually very common, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But you can see a fairly even spherical shape going all the way around this eye, except for right here we have a plateau. And this is going to create fit issues with a scleral lens, and would probably be better served with like a quadrant-specific type of design, where we could make this area a different shape than the rest of the lens. We also can see things like pinguiculas, filtering blebs will show up. I have a patient I fitted recently in a lens that has a tube shunt. It's pretty exquisite. You can see a little red line running right through the middle of the blue C up there where that tube shunt runs underneath the conj. So obviously the main value of this is going to be in fitting scleral lenses. You can think of other reasons why the shape of the sclera may be important, but essentially 99% of what we do with this data is used to optimize lens fitting. So how good are these instruments? How do they compare? Is the data I get from them actually going to help me fit scleral lenses, or is it just not accurate enough or predictable enough? So we've been compiling at Indiana University a database of patients who have been scanned on all three instruments, because we have all of them at the school. And we're up to now probably up to 70 eyes that we've done all three of these instruments scanned the patients on. What we did was we scanned the patients, we took a lens and applied it to the eye of a known sagittal depth, and then we measured the central clearance with an OCT. And what the goal was is to find out, using the instrument and predicting what the sagittal height of the eye is at a certain chord, can we then put a lens on, and would that lens be the right fit by just using our empirical data? And so this was our initial go around. We had fitted all of these patients with a scleral lens that we were targeting a clearance of about 250 to 300 microns of vault. And these were the actual data points that we got for the eye surface profiler. About 5 minutes after application, our initial vault was 214 on all the right eyes and 230 on the left. The SMAP 245 and 256, and the Pentacam 231 and 223. So the point being is that I think you can see that the instruments are quite accurate in projecting out the sagittal height of the eye. They're quite a good correlation between each of the instruments. They give similar data, which should really just reassure us that the technology to measure scleral shape is good, and it's getting better. But the data points are actually quite solid, and I think we can see that if we were to take the sagittal height from a scleral topography and apply that to a lens, that we're going to be right the majority of the time with our very first lens we put on. What about the shape of the sclera, though? Now, we talked about just the sagittal height of the eye. You know, the instrument can project the overall height of the anterior segment, but what about the toricity? Because that's such an important part of it, too. And the eye surface profiler and the Pentacam give us toricity readings in microns, and the SMAP gives us toricity readings in diopters. So there's a little bit of a difference here. But again, if you translate these diopters to microns, we're coming out pretty similar. About one diopter would be about 150 microns of toricity. So we're coming out here on the right eye with around 120, and the left eye about 140. So again, if you look across the board at the instruments, they're giving us fairly consistent readings from one instrument to the next with regards to the amount of toricity that we see in the scleral shape. And if you were to lay a map from 3 different instruments side by side on the same eye, you'd find that the topographies are quite consistent. So again, if I have a pentacam, how would I go about, let's say, fitting a patient? There's a variety of ways we can use this data to fit lenses. And one way that we can do that is simply to choose a lens size that we have in mind for this patient and adjust these settings up here to determine the sagittal height at the lens diameter we want. So let's say we want to fit a 15.4 millimeter lens. We can come up here and we can adjust the chord of the eye measurement to 15.4. It will tell us the sagittal height of the eye at 15.4. We can then add a desired vault amount, whatever you want the lens to have clearance when you apply it to the eye, and choose that as your starting point. In addition, we can use this grid here, which tells us the shape of the sclera, to calculate our peripheral curves. And essentially what we come up with is we can calculate a sag of the lens at 2 different meridians. So one meridian is telling us to be 4166, the other one 4320. So basically we need a lens of about a vault of 4200 with about 150 microns of toricity. So if I go to my fitting set, I've got a lens that has a sag of 4200. 150 microns of toricity is kind of a standard amount of toricity in my toric set. I put that on, and again, 95 times out of 100, that lens is going to be a good fit the very first time I put it on. The point again being is it saves a lot of time, and it instills a lot of confidence in the patient, in your ability, when you can go to your set, put a lens on, and hey doc, that feels great, it fits great, I can simply over refract and order. Okay, as opposed to one lens, continuing to pop lens after lens on the eye until I finally find the right fit. Again, each of these instruments provides the information a little bit differently, but ultimately all the information is there for them. Here again, we talk about how can we use the instrument to predict toricity, which is another challenge for a fitter if you have to use just a fitting set to try to accurately decide how much toricity to put in the landing zone of the lens. But here, as you can see, the eye surface profiler, it projects out. When we choose a lens design, we have our map, and we go into our lens design software. We simply choose the design we want, and it puts out diameter, base curve, and our different meridians and our different vaults. It just spits the data out for us. We have everything we need. And then again, you have 2 options. One is you can go get a diagnostic lens and put it on and over refract the patient, which is probably what you would do. And you could assess the fit and do any fine-tuning off the diagnostic lens. Or what we've started doing more and more is simply over refract and then use exactly what the instrument tells us for the lens and just order it up. And not even do any diagnostic evaluation with that first lens, but worry about more the diagnostic evaluation at our dispensing and follow-up, because we know that the vast majority of the time these data points are going to give us a very dispensable lens. Again, the SMAP has the software built in as well. You can simply press a button in your screen, which is a lens design button, and it will generate. Here's essentially all the data you would get for your scleral lens if you were fitting a Europa. It gives you a diameter, a base curve, all the peripheral curves, widths and radii, the amount of toricity, the overall sag of the lens. And so again, if I were to use my SMAP to fit a Europa, and I had a Europa fitting set, which I probably would if I were doing this a lot, I would go find a lens with a sag of around 4800, place that lens on the eye for my over refraction, and then just hit order with the parameters that the instrument gives me, but the prescription that I've over refracted through my diagnostic lens. Again, the instrumentation makes this process so much better from a fitter perspective. It takes a lot of the learning curve out in terms of which lens do I pick and how do I start and where do I go with this. The instrument's going to help you find that first best lens very quickly and allow you to just focus on evaluating and fine-tuning rather than the major steps of getting those best initial diagnostic lenses. Again, there's all sorts of ways you can use this data. This just gets into the fun part of how much effort you want to put into it. But the instruments will have things like data points on them. So literally I can take a data point and I can go to my map and I can hover anywhere and it will show me the elevation of that spot in time. So this is just an example of a patient who had an S-map done. This is an S-map printout. And I wanted to fit a scleral lens on them, but I didn't want to fit a Europa. I wanted to fit something else. But I can still use the map to design my lens even if I'm not choosing the built-in software. What I can simply do is find the lens size that I want. So in this case, I wanted to fit a 17 millimeter lens. I can take my data points and go out to the high and low points and measure. And so at this little black star, I'm on negative 180 microns. This one a negative 199, and then here I'm at plus 8 and plus 17. So based upon that, I could simply talk to my lab and say, I want this lens in this meridian to have a peripheral curve that's 10 microns flatter than standard. And in this meridian, I can order a lens which is 190 microns steeper than standard. And I know that that lens is going to be a well-fit lens from the minute I place it on the eye. So again, using these maps, you can literally design your lens right off the map information. Again, one other nice thing about having this information, you could imagine if you had to somehow design a quadrant-specific lens off of just a simple diagnostic evaluation, that would be difficult. Not only figuring out the shape of the sclera, but how much difference to put in each quadrant. But with the maps here, again, we can see this patient probably would benefit from a quadrant-specific lens. You can see the shape of the eye is very symmetric at these 3 points, but this one is very different. We're talking, over 200 microns of elevation difference from this quadrant to any of the other 3. So we can simply order the lens with peripheral curves, roughly 180, 190 microns steep all the way around, and in this quadrant I want it 40 microns flat. And that way the lens will literally be made to fit that scleral shape. So just a real quick case on how we can use this data to fit a patient. This was a patient who presented for scleral lens fitting for his left eye only. He was wearing a GP lens and was relatively happy with it, but his corneal specialist recommended that he maybe consider a scleral lens. That was fine with me. His vision with his current lens was 20/30 plus 2. This was his corneal topography at the time of his presentation. You can see what it looks like. Keep in mind he had been wearing his corneal lens when he entered for his appointment today, and you can tell by his map that he was wearing a flat-fitting GP that was molding his cornea, and here's where his lens was riding, obviously, right? So we did a scleral topography on him at this appointment, and you can see what his scleral map looked like. The lens design software told me to pick a sag of around 5200, and then I simply took my data points and marked my major meridians and the elevation at those points. In my flat meridian right here, my average toricity, or my average elevation was about 130 microns at 17 millimeters. In this meridian, it was 140 microns steep at 17 millimeters, so that's a difference of 270 microns. So we simply picked a lens with a sag of around 5200, place it on the eye. Now this is a spherical lens, so we would not expect this lens to fit that great. What you can see off of the map here, keep in mind the blue spot here is the steepest part of the sclera. And so my spherical scleral lens should have the flattest fitting relationship in those spots. And if you look at his actual photograph, that's exactly where we have edge lift, is right where our topography predicted it. So what we need to do here is, again, we need to adjust this fit. We want to flatten the fit peripherally in this meridian here, and we want to steepen the edges in this meridian here. You can see the central clearance with that lens looks pretty good. Our instrument did a good job of predicting what lens sagittal height we would need. And we over-refracted this eye then with the diagnostic lens and found this over-refraction plus 250 minus 2 at 45 got us to 20/20. Now again, if you looked at that over-refraction, you were fitting him in a corneal GP, I don't know, do you want to fit him in the front toric or not? I'm not a big fan of front toric corneal gas perms, especially on cones, but you could. The nice thing about sclerals is you can throw toricity on these all day long and nobody knows the difference. And so we prescribe as low as a half diopter of toricity on scleral lenses routinely. But with this individual, we had an over-refraction of minus 2 at 45. We do have to account for lens rotation. And so our lens was rotated 35 to the right. So we do our Lars calculation and come up with our lens power. And so what we ended up with was an 8.5, 5400, 17 diameter. We went peripherally, we went flat 90 by steep 90, and calculating our over-refraction. We dispensed the lens, and it was better vision than he had with his corneal lens. His comfort was excellent. You can see the fluorescein pattern, but importantly here, you can see the lens rotation. Here's the marking, which shows that it indeed rotated out so that our flat meridian matched the flat meridian of the scleral map, and the steep matched the steep meridian of the shape. So again, the scleral maps are great at telling us about the shape of the sclera, and they do allow us to more accurately fit lenses more quickly. Again, just to kind of recap as we move on now to more of a literature review, if you're fitting scleral lenses, increasingly you're going to find that having these instruments makes you more efficient and opens up your practice to fitting a wider range of lenses in more complex designs. If you're not fitting scleral lenses now and you have an interest, these instruments will allow you to become more proficient more quickly. They will push your learning curve up to the point where you can become good at this very quickly. So just going to spend a few minutes talking about what we know about scleral shape from a population perspective, like a demographic evaluation. The research on scleral shape really started with this Pacific University study in 2010, which used OCT imaging to look at the shape of the sclera, in particular scleral angles. We were looking, with this study, was looking at corneoscleral junction angles and scleral angles. And the way the data was reported, again, this is not elevation or curvature, these are angles. So the instrument was looking at between 10 and 15 millimeter chord, between the 10 millimeter chord of the cornea and the 15 millimeter chord on the sclera. What is the angle of shape in that 5 millimeter zone? And then going between 15 and 20, what is the angle of shape in that 15 to 20 millimeter zone? And what we found about the data is this, just to summarize. They found that the transition from cornea to limbus, we all have this notion of the eyeball. Whenever someone sketches a picture of an eye, right? We do our cornea, and then we do this abrupt curvature change to the sclera. So our eye looks like this. And the reality is this little jut where the cornea and the limbus come together, there's not this dramatic curvature change that we all imagine or we see in pictures. The transition from cornea to sclera is often much more linear than we think. We know from this study also the scleral shape is unpredictable and that it seems to be impacted by the insertion of the extraocular muscles, meaning that most eyes are flatter nasally and steeper inferotemporally. So it's just something to keep in mind, that sclera shape, that nasal quadrant is almost always your high point of your sclera, and your low point is often going to be down and out. And that's important to note because with any lens, they tend to go to the steepest part of the eye. And so if our steepest part of the eye is down and out, that means our lenses in general are going to ride down and out. And so when you look at a scleral lens, sometimes you'll see it looks like it's decentering down and out. And I would say, yeah, that's exactly what you should expect. Again, unless you're fitting a completely custom lens that's free-form, perfectly fitted to the eye, you're going to have some areas of misalignment. It's going to ride down and out. Now, what is the shape of the sclera in general? This was just a study we did a couple years ago where we looked at corneal topography compared to scleral topography. And the point of this was to say, if you don't have a scleral topographer, but you do have a corneal topographer, can you somehow extrapolate your corneal topography to the scleral shape? If I just know what the cornea looks like, can I predict the sclera from that? And the answer is not really. But what you can see is that we found, we took just a group of with the rule cornea patients, and of those folks who had with the rule cornea, almost half of those folks had an against the rule sclera. And what that means, again, is that the sclera in general, I mean, I don't know if you look at the general population, if you did corneal topography on 100 people, how many people would you expect would have with the rule corneal cylinder? 80, 90%? Maybe 10 or 15% are spherical, and maybe 5% are against the rule. Against the rule is pretty uncommon, right? The reality is, when we look at scleral topography, it's almost 50-50. So against the rule shape of the sclera is actually pretty common. And the trend is that as you, and this is certainly, there's no statistical significance to this, but in my experience, what we found over time is that if you have somebody with a strong with the rule cornea, when you get to the sclera, that with the rule tends to dissipate and form an almost spherical sclera. Whereas if I have a spherical cornea, by the time I get to the sclera, I've moved against the rule. So there's this definite trend, the further we get out in the periphery, we get more and more against the rule with our shape. And that's probably, again, due to the way the extraocular muscles affect the scleral shape. This study was published in 2017 by a group based at Pacific again, Michael Ritzman, and they were looking at the shape of the sclera, again, using OCT images. And what they found, again, is that at 12.8 millimeter chord, the average eye shape is rotationally stable. What that means is we're going to talk in a minute about just how irregularly shaped the sclera is. But at 12.8, the sclera, or the eye itself, and in some cases this is just at the limbus essentially, is actually very rotationally stable. It means it could be either spherical or toric, but the toricity is regular. By the time we get out to about 15 millimeters, we start to see these asymmetries showing up on our maps. Meaning that, again, the extraocular muscles are starting to affect the shape of the eye, and we're getting more irregular, where we may have a high point over here and we don't match 180 degrees away. We don't have symmetry to our eye shape. Again, this study also backed up the point that nasally we're flatter and temporally we tend to be steeper. So this was a much larger study that was published about 1.5 years ago on a large group of eyes. 140 eyes were analyzed with scleral topography now. This is using scleral topography, not OCT. This was using the SMAP instrument, and of the 140 eyes at a 16 millimeter chord, what was really surprising was only less than 6% of people have a regularly shaped spherical sclera. And we use the term spherical very loosely because the criteria for spherical shape was less than 300 microns of toricity, which seems like an awful lot. I'd fit most of those folks in a toric lens still. But essentially, less than 6% fit the criteria for spherical. Less than 30% were regularly toric, which means that almost 70% of these 140 eyes measured had an asymmetric or irregularly shaped sclera. The point is here is that, if you look at the number of individuals out there fitting scleral lenses, probably 70% or 60% of scleral lenses fit in this country have spherical peripheral curves. Okay, nobody's spherical though. The other 30 to 40% are regularly toric. Okay, that's still not a very good number. If we're really fitting people optimally, what this study is showing is we should be using quadrant-specific or even free-form lens technology on close to 70% of our patients wearing sclerals if we want an optimal fit. So let's take a look at how we evaluate this briefly. This is just the way that we evaluate scleral shape in this study is we take our scleral map and we choose a ring. So again, in this study we chose a 16 millimeter ring. And we plot out the elevation at each of these points. And then we translate that to a sinusoidal curve and look at the high points and the low points of the map. So here again we have our low point. Our steepest part is down here at the trough. The high points are going to be up here at the peaks. And so as we plot this eye out and put it on a curve, then we can assess the shape of the sclera and its regularity. Again, it's important as we look at these maps to keep in mind that the scale here is vital. The scale changes. So as you look at this picture over here that looks jagged, you'd say that's very irregular. But the reality is that's actually a spherical sclera because the scale is very tight. So each of these little peaks and troughs indicates like just 50 microns of shape change, which is insignificant. Here again, here's one that looks somewhat toric, but the reality is the scale is so tight that this individual is categorized as spherical. Okay? So again, less than 6% of people fall into the spherical category. Here's an example of what you would consider a spherical scleral shape. It looks pretty good. There's a little high point down here, but it's low enough. The difference is little enough that we would not consider this a toric or irregular eye. Now we look at these maps, I think you would agree if you look at this topography that this is a very regular shaped toricity. We're flat here and we're steep here, and they're pretty nicely opposing meridians, pretty much 90 degrees apart. And the high points and the low points are very symmetric. So we end up with these plots where the peaks and troughs are fairly symmetric. These are eyes that are regularly toric. And again, these comprise about 30% of the study database. And then we have our asymmetric torics, where it is toric, but the peaks or troughs are very different. Here you can see a difference of about 400 microns between the two low points. Okay, that's a difference that's high enough to take this and make it not a toric eye, but an asymmetric toric eye. Here's images of irregularly shaped eyes, where again, the peaks and troughs, we have multiple peaks and troughs. We don't have a typical sinusoidal curve. All right, real quickly here, let's skip this one. I want to talk about, again, the impact of lens fitting on all of this part. First of all, what we know is that the scleral and the conjunctiva tissue is very forgiving. So as we look at these eyes and we think of all these numbers of people who have irregular eye shapes and why we're fitting them in simple lenses, it's because this overlying conjunctiva is very forgiving. And most eyes have a degree of toricity. Whether it's regular or irregular, we probably should be using toric landing zones on most of our scleral lens fits. The instrumentation is getting to the point where, again, it can tell us a lot about the fit of an eye very quickly, the shape of an eye, and that's going to streamline our fitting. Even for a simple spherical eye, you look at this and say, well, that's pretty spherical shape, but it's also very steep. I mean, there's a lot of blue here. And so from an elevation perspective, this eye is going to be very steep. And that would help me right away to know that if I put a regular diagnostic lens on that patient, I'm probably going to have edge lift and I'm going to have lens awareness. And so I can tell the patient, hey, look, this is the best lens I have to try on you. I'm going to tell you right now, it's not going to feel great, but bear with me because I'll get you a lens that fits better. And then I can simply design a lens that has a steeper fit when I finally order something for the patient. Again, based upon the Ritzman study, we know that when we are dealing with issues with lots of asymmetry, we're having struggles getting a good fit, that by going smaller, we get to a more regular part of the eye, and it can be easier to get a better fit on those patients whose eye is very asymmetric. Getting closer to that 15 millimeter cord or less, we pick up a great deal more regularity to the eye shape. And again, this instrument-aided fitting concept, we have instrument-aided software to fit corneal GPs, and it's great. But the reality is it's never really caught on with most of us, and that's because corneal lenses just aren't that hard to fit in most cases. Most patients who we would fit a corneal lens on who don't have an irregular cornea, it's a straightforward approach to fitting. But with scleral shape being predominantly asymmetric and irregular shaped, it's a different story. So this instrument-aided fitting is really helpful because it allows us to take a scan of an eye and create a lens based on that map that will fit right from the outset. And in particular, if we're going to be fitting things like quadrant-specific lenses, this is very difficult to do if you don't have some type of image of the shape of the eye. If you're going to take just someone's eye and have no concept of the shape of this eye and just start throwing diagnostic lenses on their eye, it's going to be hard for you to arrive at a high-quality quadrant-specific fit without dabbling around with remakes and reorders to achieve it. With instrumentation, it's simple to do a quadrant-specific fit, whether you do it yourself by simply measuring points, or you actually let the software design the lens for you. For example, here's a scleral map, and here is a quadrant-specific design with all of the individual parameters calculated out for you. So by simply spending 10 minutes by capturing a bilateral map, you have now fitted this lens in a very high-quality, state-of-the-art, advanced way with quadrant-specific lenses that didn't require reorders and reappointments to achieve it. And again, the final frontier for scleral fitting, of course, is the complete freeform lens design, which we have the capability of doing now. It's just very expensive. But as more and more of this transitions to instrumentation and competition grows, the prices should come down. Right now, we do have the ability with the iPrint Pro to get a mold of an eye within 1 minute, using that mold, sending it to the lab, and creating a completely customized lens that perfectly fits the eye shape. In this video, just wanted to show you this real quick because this is another way of doing a quadrant or a freeform design. This is using the SMAP, now has the capability of doing a freeform design. So you can look at, as you move around the clock here on this eye shape, you can see how the lens shape changes. It's going to do it a little quicker so it's easier to imagine or see the changes as you go around. But you can see how that lens changes shape as you go around the clock to better contour the eye. Again, there's really no way that you can do a lens like that without this imaging equipment. So as we move forward, the future of scleral lenses, someone asked me yesterday, why don't we do this on every patient? Yeah, why don't we? It's just cost prohibitive now. But the prices have come down dramatically by using instrumentation rather than the molds. And I envision a time when we're going to be able to do completely freeform lenses like this for under $1,000 a pop, which seems like a lot, but you have to realize that some of these lenses are over $3,000 a lens right now. When the price comes down to less than $1,000 a lens, I think most people who need scleral lenses will want to evolve into this type of technology to get a perfect fit for their eye. Again, just to summarize, key points, the sclera is more spherical the closer we are to the limbus. That's important to remember. The sclera is more asymmetric than it is symmetric in general. The sclera tends to a more against the rule shape than corneas do. Scleral lens fitting should be driven towards more toric haptics, quadrant specifics, and freeforms as technology drives us that way. And the instrumentation to guide the fitting process will make this a reality for any of us who choose to do this type of fitting, even right now. So again, if you have any questions about this, I'm happy to take questions afterwards while we're changing over, or at any point today I'll be around. Please feel free to ask. Thanks for your attention.